Throughout this series, we've talked about the gods, and even had a video about humanity. Today, we're discussing the heroes in Greek mythology, who have greatly inspired modern pop culture. The age of heroes in Greek mythology lies between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, which is basically our time. It's often considered to have started after Zeus's great flood wiped out the Bronze Age people and ended with the Trojan War and a few events that followed, such as Odysseus' journey home or the death of Agamemnon. The ancient Greeks created a sequence of events from various stories about heroes, also linking these heroes to one another through family connections and worshipping them like gods. The difference is that there was no fixed list of heroes. New gods no longer came into existence, but heroes kept being born like rabbits. The original purpose of these hero stories was to explain the formation of Greek city-states and the areas influenced by them. Over time, the stories reflected a shift in the Greeks' understanding of their position in the world. Previously, they were fearful and revered the divine, the natural universe. But now they were more confident, willing to face the gods, having developed the strength to survive the harshness of nature. The most famous hero is Hercules. The story about Hercules should be here, but I've skipped ahead. This video isn't about Hercules specifically, but will give an overview of the age of heroes. The final part of Hercules' story will be covered in the next video. The Greek hero era spanned 6 generations, with Hercules belonging to the 2nd generation. The heroes of the 1st generation are typically descendants of gods, and either directly or indirectly helped to pioneer and build Greece and the world. They are also the ancestors of later generations of heroes. In general, heroes are just the children of gods. The first hero is said to be Cadmus, the prince of Sidon. Cadmus was the son of King Agenor, who was the son of Poseidon in Libya. Libya was the daughter of Epiphos, and Epaphos was the son of Zeus and Io in Egypt. In general, Cadmus is Zeus and Poseidon's grandson. In different versions of the story, Cadmus had several brothers, but the most common ones are Phoenix and Cilix. They were forced to leave and establish themselves in different lands. The story goes that after having many sons, King Agenor longed for a daughter. After much effort, he finally had one and named her Europa. Europa grew up under the care and affection of her family, becoming more beautiful as she got older. Her fame spread far and wide, even reaching Zeus's ears. One day, when Europa invited her sisters and friends to go for a swim at the beach, Zeus transformed into a golden-haired bull and went down to the spot where the girls were playing. The girls, upon seeing the bull, gathered around to pet it. When it was Europa's turn, the bull knelt as if inviting her to ride on its back. Europa climbed on, and the bull suddenly jumped up and ran straight into the sea, disappearing without a trace. The girls from Sidon screamed in terror and chased after them, but they couldn't catch up. Zeus then took Europa to the island of Crete, south of Greece. On the shores, the golden bull transformed back into Zeus and made love to the young woman. At that time, Greece was situated between 2 enormous landmasses separated by a vast sea. One landmass was called Asia, which today refers only to the area of Turkey. When Asia was later used to refer to the entire continent from Turkey eastward, the original Asia was renamed Asia Minor. As for the land to the west, which the Greeks hadn't yet understood or explored, the people of Crete called it by the name of the distant young woman from the faraway land, Europa. And in Vietnamese, we call it Europe. King Agenor, upon realizing his daughter had disappeared, ordered his sons to go search for her. He told them that they shouldn't return without finding Europa. So Cadmus and his brothers went off to search in different directions, but of course they couldn't find the lover of an Olympian god. Fearing the wrath of the gods, none of them dared to return. Each brother eventually settled in a different land to establish a new life. Cilix went to the coast of Asia Minor, where he founded the city of Cilicia in modern-day Turkey. Phoenix returned to the nearby shores and established a prosperous land. This region became known as Phoenicia, the land of Phoenix, which corresponds to the area of present-day Lebanon and Syria. Cadmus arrived in Greece initially unsure of where to go, so he went to the Oracle of Delphi to seek guidance. Following the advice of the god of light, Apollo, Cadmus, along with some of his servants, set off on a journey. They traveled on and on until they encountered a pure white cow, grazing without a herder. Upon seeing the strangers, the cow stopped eating and walked away. Cadmus and his servants followed the cow until it reached the plains of Boeotia, where it stopped, glanced at Cadmus, and lay down to rest. At that moment, Cadmus realized that this was the land where he would settle. He arranged stones to create an altar and prepared a sacrifice to thank the gods. However, there was no water to slaughter the cow, so Cadmus sent his servants to find some. His servants ventured into a forest and came upon a deep cave with water inside. But inside the cave was a large serpent, the offspring of the war god Ares. Cadmus waited for a long time but saw no sign of his men, and the sun was setting. So he grabbed his sword and ventured into the forest to look for them. He eventually found the stream and saw his men being attacked by the serpent. Cadmus bent down, grabbed a large stone, and threw it at the serpent. The stone was so large that it would take 3 or 4 men to lift it, and if it had hit a wooden house, it would have collapsed. But the serpent remained unmoved, like a mountain. Seeing this, Cadmus took his spear and charged at the serpent, stabbing it in its body. He then drew his sword and struck the serpent's head with all his might as if chopping wood. The blow was so powerful that the serpent's head flew off, while the body remained draped across a giant tree. While Cadmus was still looking at the serpent, Athena appeared and said 2 things: that Cadmus would eventually be transformed into a serpent, that he should take the serpent's teeth and plant them in a well-plowed field. As soon as the serpent's teeth were planted, an army fully armored and armed sprang up from the ground. Cadmus quickly drew his sword, ready to fight, but the warriors told him not to interfere and immediately began fighting each other. Eventually, only 5 warriors remained. Athena appeared again and ordered them to reconcile and form a brotherhood. These were the 5 tiger generals who helped Cadmus build the mighty Cadmea, which later became known as the famous 7-gated city of Thebes. Cadmus later married Harmonia, the goddess of harmony, daughter of Ares and Aphrodite. As the years passed, the city of Thebes grew more bustling and prosperous, but fate doesn't always grant complete happiness. For killing Ares' son, Cadmus's family was cursed. His children met tragic ends. Semele, the mother of the wine god Dionysus, was burned alive by Zeus's thunderbolt. Ino, who cared for Dionysus, was punished by Hera, who made her husband go mad and forced him to drive Ino to madness, causing him to kill their child. Ino fled with another child, but eventually jumped into the sea to escape. Actaeon, Cadmus's grandson, was turned into a stag by Artemis and was torn apart by his own hunting dogs. Another daughter of Cadmus, Agave, was driven mad by Dionysus and, mistaking her son Pentheus for a lion, led her servants in tearing him apart. Tragically, Pentheus was Cadmus's heir. Devastated by these events, the elderly couple Cadmus and Harmonia left Thebes. They traveled on until they were exhausted and had to stop in the distant land of Illyria, which is modern-day Croatia, Slovenia, and Bosnia. There, Cadmus remembered Athena's words from long ago and declared that if killing the serpent was his crime, then let him be transformed into a serpent. So the gods turned Cadmus and Harmonia into serpents. Interestingly, Harmonia was actually related to the serpent Cadmus had slain before, and that is the story of Cadmus. In the first generation of heroes, we must also mention Perseus, who was also a descendant of Epiphos, a distant relative of Cadmus. The story begins in the mighty city of Argos, ruled by a king named Acrisios. Acrisios was childless for a long time and only had one daughter, Danae. As Danae grew older, she became so beautiful that no one in Argos could compare to her. However, Acrisios was determined to have a son to carry on his lineage. Acrisios went to the Oracle of Delphi to seek guidance, and the prophecy he received was that he would be killed by his grandson. In an attempt to prevent this fate, but unable to bring himself to kill his daughter, Acrisios built an underground chamber and locked Danae inside. This way no one could reach her, and no one would know about her to propose marriage. But Acrisios' plans were no match for Zeus's will, and Zeus was feeling amorous. Taking pity on the young woman who had never known love, Zeus transformed into golden rain. The raindrops passed through the roof of the chamber and fell into Danae's lap. As a result, Danae became pregnant and gave birth to a son, Perseus. When Acrisios learned of Perseus's birth, he was furious. But just like before, Acrisios couldn't bring himself to kill his own daughter or grandson. He ordered that a large wooden chest be made, big enough to lock both Danae and Perseus inside, and then cast it into the sea, hoping that the ocean's waves would consume them. This way, Acrisios wouldn't be directly responsible for their deaths. But once again, Zeus thwarted Acrisios' plan. The god instructed his brother Poseidon to use the waves to carry the chest to the island of Seriphos, where Danae and Perseus were rescued by the kind fisherman Dictys. They were taken in by Dictys and his wife, treated with care and raised as part of the family. Not long after, the young Perseus grew into a handsome, tall, and strong young man. He would go out to sea every day with Dictys and return with a boat full of fish. Life seemed to flow peacefully with a humble hut and a few golden hearts. But one day, King Polydectes of the island of Seriphos heard news of the 2 survivors who had drifted ashore and decided to check them out. Polydectes was the younger brother of the old fisherman Dictys, a cruel and greedy man who took all the family wealth and left his brother to live in poverty. When Polydectes saw how beautiful Danae was, he came up with a plan to take her as his wife. However, he didn't want to take on the extra responsibility of caring for Perseus, so he decided to get rid of him. One day, Polydectes invited Perseus to a grand feast. During the party, Polydectes stood up and declared that there would be a great celebration and that gifts were expected. The nobility and guests offered him everything from cloaks of the highest quality to statues, stickers, and even Lego sets. But Perseus, feeling embarrassed that he had nothing to offer, declared that he would go kill the Gorgon and bring back its head as a gift for Polydectes. The Gorgons were a trio of monstrous sisters with snakes for hair and eyes that could turn anyone who looked into them into stone. Among the three, Medusa was the youngest and fiercest, but she could be killed, while the other two were immortal. One version of the story claimed that Medusa was once a priestess of Athena who was raped by Poseidon and, as punishment, was transformed into a Gorgon. So Perseus set his sights on Medusa, but he had no idea where to find her. Knowing that Perseus was the son of a god, Zeus sent Athena and Hermes down to help him. Hermes led Perseus to meet the Graeae, three monstrous sisters who shared one eye among them, taking turns to use it. Perseus snatched the eye and threatened to keep it unless they gave him Medusa's location. Reluctantly, the Graeae revealed where Medusa could be found. Next, Perseus had to visit the northern nymphs to prepare for his mission. They had been waiting to provide him with a golden gear set that included a pair of winged sandals like Hermes, the helmet of invisibility from Hades, and a magical pouch to carry Medusa's head. Hermes also gave Perseus the legendary sword to deal critical damage, while Athena provided him with the shield of the sun to enhance his defenses. With his gear in hand, Perseus traveled to the Gorgon's lair. Thanks to the helmet of invisibility, he was able to sneak past the two sleeping Gorgon sisters without being noticed. However, Medusa was awake and armed with a bow, waiting for him. Perseus hid behind a column to avoid being hit by her arrows and then realized that Athena's shield also functioned like a mirror. Using the reflection to avoid looking directly at Medusa, Perseus located her and then leapt out, slicing off the monster's head. In one version of the story, Medusa and her sisters were all sleeping, and Perseus was guided by Hermes to simply fly down and chop off her head. The shield allowed him to avoid gazing directly into Medusa's deadly eyes. When Medusa's head was severed, from her neck sprang a giant riding a winged horse, Chrysaor, and the horse Pegasus. Both of them flew off, unconcerned with Perseus or Medusa. Perseus then took Medusa's head, placed it in the magical pouch, and flew back home. On his way back, Perseus flew over Ethiopia and spotted a young woman chained to a rock by the sea. Suddenly, a sea monster emerged from the water, swimming straight towards the girl. Without hesitation, Perseus swooped down and struck the monster, freeing the girl. This young woman was Andromeda, the daughter of King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia of Ethiopia. The queen, like any mother, was deeply fond of her daughter, but she had boasted that Andromeda's beauty surpassed that of the Nereides, the sea nymphs. This boast reached the ears of the Nereides, who then went to Poseidon to demand that he punish Cassiopeia for her arrogance. In response, Poseidon sent a sea monster to ravage the land of King Cepheus. Desperate, Cepheus turned to the oracle and was told that the only way to save his kingdom was to sacrifice his daughter, Andromeda, to the beast. However, thanks to Perseus, Andromeda was saved, and the entire kingdom of Ethiopia was spared from destruction. As a token of gratitude for Perseus's heroic deed, Cepheus offered Andromeda's hand in marriage to the Greek hero. The wedding of Perseus was a grand celebration, held in the palace of King Cepheus. It was not just a joyous day for the royal family, but for all the people of Ethiopia. Everywhere, lanterns were hung and flowers decorated, and a feast was held in celebration with the sound of weapons clashing in the background. Wait, why are there weapons at a wedding? Those were the weapons of Phineus, promised to Andromeda before she was sacrificed to the sea monster. When he heard that his fiancée had been given to the monster, he disappeared without a trace. But now, upon hearing that the monster was slain and Andromeda was to marry another man, he showed up to cause trouble. King Cepheus tried to calm him down, but Phineus refused to listen. Without a word, he pushed the king aside and charged at Perseus, but missed. Perseus, unafraid, stood his ground, declaring that he could take on all of them by himself. With his legendary sword, Perseus struck down each of Phineus's men with one hit. Some of King Cepheus's guests rushed to help Perseus, but Phineus's forces were too numerous. Soon, only Perseus and a few others were left, backed into a corner. However, Perseus remained unshaken, as he still had one trump card. He shouted for anyone who was his ally to close their eyes and then pulled out Medusa's head from the magical pouch, holding it towards the enemy. In an instant, all of Phineus's soldiers turned to stone, their bodies frozen in place. Phineus, cornered, shut his eyes tightly and begged Perseus for mercy, but it was too late. Perseus held the head of Medusa in front of him and scared Phineus into opening his eyes. The moment Phineus looked at the head, he turned to stone. forever frozen in a posture of cowardice. Phineas became a living symbol of weakness and submission, a monument to his own fear. After his glorious victory, Perseus stayed in Ethiopia for a few days. Although King Cepheus wanted to offer him the inheritance of the throne, Perseus firmly declined and asked for permission to take his wife back to introduce her to his mother and old friend Dictys. Meanwhile, back on the island of Seriphos, Polydectes continued to pursue Danae, trying to win her over. When his attempts failed, he decided to abduct her. Fortunately, Danae was tipped off by a loyal servant and managed to escape into a temple. In ancient Greece, there was a custom that anyone who sought protection in a temple would be under the gods' protection, and no one could harm or disrespect them within the sacred space. Polydectes, enraged but still cautious, didn't dare violate the sanctity of the temple, so he stationed his thugs outside, waiting for an opportunity when Danae would let her guard down. When Perseus returned to Seriphos, he quickly learned of the situation and rushed straight to the palace. Polydectes was sitting with his court, drinking and celebrating, and everyone was stunned to see Perseus. Perseus, pretending to be respectful, bowed to Polydectes and then revealed the head of Medusa to the assembly. Instantly, Polydectes and all his followers turned to stone. Afterward, Perseus went to the temple to reunite with his mother. When Polydectes' men saw Perseus, some fled, some kneeled and begged for mercy, and others were swiftly cut down by Perseus. Perseus then took his mother back to the palace and invited Dictys and his wife for a reunion. Things gradually returned to normal, and Dictys became the new king of Seriphos, replacing the now stoned Polydectes. Danae was overjoyed to see that Perseus had settled down, and was equally pleased with his choice of wife, Andromeda. However, Danae was getting older, and Perseus suggested that they return to his homeland. Danae had been thinking about this for some time, and when Perseus made the suggestion, she was delighted. So the three of them set off for Argos. Before leaving, Perseus made sure to return the gifts he had received from Athena, Hermes, Hades, and the northern nymphs. He also presented the head of Medusa to Athena, who immediately placed it on her shield, adding a formidable touch to her already powerful weapon. The news of Perseus' return to Argos greatly troubled King Acrisios. The prophecy still echoed in his mind, and he feared that Perseus had come to fulfill it by killing him. In an attempt to avoid his fate, the king secretly left Argos and fled to Larissa, a distant region in Thessaly, far from Argos. When Perseus arrived in his homeland, he found that his grandfather had already fled, and Danae was unable to meet her father. With no ruler in the kingdom, Perseus took it upon himself to assume the throne and rule in place of his grandfather. The following day, King Teutamides of Larissa organized a grand athletic festival, which attracted young, strong men from all around. Hearing of this event, Perseus decided to enter the discus throwing competition. On the day of the event, Perseus stepped onto the field, stretched, and prepared to throw with perfect form. With impeccable technique and a flawless execution, he hurled the discus. However, the discus flew off course and struck a spectator in the stands, killing him instantly without a single word. To Perseus' shock and sorrow, the man he had accidentally killed was none other than his grandfather, Acrisios. Devastated by the tragic accident, Perseus held a grand funeral for Acrisios. He also felt unworthy of ruling Argos and decided not to return there. Instead, Perseus and his uncle Megapenthes, king of Tiryns, agreed to exchange kingdoms. From that point on, Megapenthes ruled over Argos, while Perseus became king of Tiryns. Among the descendants of Perseus, the most famous was Hercules, his great-grandson on his mother's side and half-brother on his father's side. The last name to mention in the first generation of heroes is Bellerophon. Actually, this was just a nickname. Originally, this young man's name was Hipponus. The story goes that in Corinthia, there was a tyrant named Belleros. Hipponus killed him and was given the name Bellerophon, meaning the slayer of Belleros. However, according to ancient Greek laws, murder was a serious crime. So, Bellerophon had to flee his homeland and sought refuge in the kingdom of Tiryns under King Proetus. Proetus was the brother of Acrisios and the father of Megapenthes, who had exchanged kingdoms with Perseus, allowing Perseus to rule Tiryns. Proetus performed a purification ritual for Bellerophon and allowed him to live in the royal palace with his family. Everything seemed peaceful, but things took a turn when Proetus' wife, Queen Sthenoboea, turned out to be a promiscuous woman. One day, while her husband was away, she attempted to seduce Bellerophon in a rather crude manner. However, Bellerophon firmly rejected her advances, much to Sthenoboea's displeasure. Enraged, she falsely accused Bellerophon of trying to assault her. Proetus was furious and wanted to kill Bellerophon, but he feared committing murder, especially since Bellerophon was his guest. Instead, he passed the responsibility to his father-in-law, King Ibates of Lycia, by sending a sealed letter that only he and his father-in-law could understand. Upon arriving in Lycia, Bellerophon was warmly welcomed by King Iobates, who threw a grand feast for him. After indulging in the festivities, Iobates opened the letter and secretly cursed his son-in-law. However, the king had to keep Bellerophon in his palace for a few days to figure out how to deal with him. Bellerophon, however, proved to be incredibly strong, pure, and innocent, which made it hard for Iobates to believe the accusations written in the letter. Iobates also realized that Protus was trying to shift the burden of the crime onto him. While the king considered sparing Bellerophon, he came up with another way to punish him. He decided to send Bellerophon on a dangerous mission to slay the fearsome Chimera. The Chimera was a monstrous creature with the head of a lion, the body of a goat, and the tail of a dragon. It was the offspring of Typhon, making it one of the most fearsome beings in Greek mythology. For King Iobates, sending Bellerophon to slay the Chimera was a way to avoid committing murder, while for the young Bellerophon, it was a challenge to prove his bravery. To defeat the Chimera, Bellerophon needed a weapon that would give him an edge. Knowing that Perseus had defeated Medusa with the help of his winged sandals, Bellerophon decided to find something that would allow him to fly. He then remembered the winged horse, Pegasus, which had been born from the blood of Medusa. Now, this part of the story is a bit of a timeline confusion, as Bellerophon was old enough to be a contemporary of Perseus' grandfather. Yet he knew of Perseus' victory and set out to find Pegasus while still young. In Greek mythology, the timeline isn't always strictly followed, and sometimes things just don't line up. It's part of the charm, so we'll roll with it. Returning to the story, Bellerophon traveled to Mount Helicon, the home of the Muses, where he found the Hippocrene Spring, a place where Pegasus often came to drink. However, as soon as the horse caught sight of him, it spread its wings and flew off into the sky. Bellerophon couldn't catch it, so he sought guidance from the seer Polyidus, who advised him to sleep in the temple of Athena and wait for divine instructions. Bellerophon followed Polyidus' advice, and that night he dreamed of Athena, who gave him a golden bridle to tame Pegasus. When he awoke, there was no sign of Athena, but the golden bridle was lying on the ground beside him. The next time Pegasus came to drink from the spring, Bellerophon approached with the golden bridle, and this time, the horse allowed him to tame it. With the winged horse under his control, Bellerophon armed himself with a sword and set off to face the Chimera. Essentially, Bellerophon became like a Mongol cavalryman, but with a flying horse. The Chimera, grounded and spewing fire from its mouth, attempted to retaliate, but Bellerophon used specially crafted lead-tipped arrows, as instructed by the gods. When these arrows struck the Chimera's burning body, the lead melted, preventing the creature's wounds from healing. The Chimera, in agony, became even more erratic, firing fire in all directions. After an intense battle with Bellerophon, the creature was finally consumed by its own flames. Bellerophon returned to Iobates with his victorious conquest, his name forever etched in glory for slaying the Chimera. But King Iobates still wasn't done testing Bellerophon. He gave him another dangerous task, to conquer the Selimi tribes, allies of the Amazon warriors. The Selimi were skilled horse riders and archers, just like Bellerophon, but their horses couldn't fly like Pegasus. You can probably guess how that would play out, one side flying and shooting arrows from the sky while the other was stuck on the ground. It was a one-sided battle. Yet, Iobates didn't stop there. He sent an ambush to target Bellerophon as he returned from his victory. Bellerophon was a bit caught off guard, but as the hero of the story, he fought them all off. It was only after this final challenge that Iobates finally acknowledged Bellerophon's greatness. He gave his daughter to Bellerophon in marriage and half of his land to govern. The people of Lycia hailed Bellerophon as the great hero of their land. Afterward, Bellerophon visited King Protus in Tiryns. When news of his return reached Stheniboia, she was so ashamed of her past actions that she took her own life. It seemed that Bellerophon would continue to achieve glorious feats for Lycia. But then one day, out of the blue, Bellerophon made a decision. He no longer wanted to live on Earth. He wanted to ascend to Mount Olympus and live among the gods. So he jumped on Pegasus and flew towards the heavens. But things didn't go as planned. Zeus saw Bellerophon flying up and with a mere flick of his hand, made Pegasus go mad. The winged horse bucked Bellerophon off, sending him plummeting to the underworld. As for Pegasus, the horse returned to Olympus to serve Zeus and the other gods. Before Hercules' time, Bellerophon, along with Cadmus and Perseus, was one of the renowned heroes, famous for hunting rare and mythical creatures. And that's the story of the first generation of heroes. Now let's move on to Generation 2. If the stories from the first generation of heroes were somewhat scattered, the heroes of the second generation are more commonly referred to as the Argonauts, as most of them were part of the crew that sailed on the Argo to retrieve the Golden Fleece. To understand this better, we must return to the family of Cadmus. In ancient Boeotia, there was a kind and just king named Athamas. He had two children, a son, Phrixus, and a daughter, Helle. It is unclear what happened, But Athamas and his wife separated. Although not young, he was not yet old and still had 2 small children to care for. So Athamas decided to remarry in order to find a new wife to help take care of his children. And he wed Ino, the daughter of King Cadmus. This is where the classic Cinderella story gets a little darker. Ino, over time, came up with a plan to get rid of her husband's children from his previous marriage. She devised a scheme to ruin the harvest by forcing women in the city to roast wheat before sowing it, which resulted in the crops failing to grow. This caused a famine, and Athamas, concerned for his people, sent a delegation to consult the oracle at Delphi. When the delegates returned, Ino met them and bribed them to deliver a false prophecy, claiming that the only way for the people to be saved was for King Athamas to sacrifice his 2 children to the gods. Since the prophecy came from the oracle, Athamas felt compelled to follow it, fearing the wrath of the gods. He prepared an altar to sacrifice his children, but just as he was about to carry out the gruesome act, a miraculous event occurred. A golden winged ram descended from the sky and appeared before the altar. The ram broke the children's bonds, and they quickly climbed onto its back and flew away. This ram was sent by Nephele, the children's mother, to rescue them. Phrixus and Helle flew eastward toward Asia Minor, but during the journey Helle succumbed to motion sickness, lost her grip, and fell into the sea, where the strait between Europe and Asia is named after her, the Hellespont. Phrixus, however, reached Colchis safely. In Colchis, King Aedes warmly welcomed Phrixus. As Phrixus grew older, he was even given the king's daughter as a wife. To show gratitude to the gods for his miraculous rescue, Phrixus sacrificed the golden ram that had saved him, offering its fleece to the gods. He then gave the ram's golden fleece to his father-in-law, King Aetes, as a token of his thanks. King Aetes considered the fleece a sacred treasure, so he hung it on a great oak tree in the forest, where it was guarded by a fierce dragon that never slept. This dragon kept a constant watch over the golden fleece, ensuring no one could steal it. As for King Athamas, as I mentioned earlier, Hera caused him to lose his sanity. In his madness, he killed his wife and children, and this tragic story was part of the chain of events involving Ino and Athamas. That's the story of the Golden Fleece. And as for the Argonauts, things get a bit complicated. The origin of the Argonauts begins with a royal dispute in the city of Iolcos, Thessaly. The founder of Iolcos was Cretheus, who had a wife named Tyro and a son named Aeson. However, Poseidon had an affair with Tyro and fathered twin sons, Peleus and Neleus. When this affair was exposed, Tyro was imprisoned by her mother-in-law, Sidero. Peleus and Neleus were abandoned in the forest, but were fortunately rescued and raised by some shepherds. As they grew up, Peleus returned to Iolcos, killed Sidero, rescued Tyro, and seized the throne from Aeson. Aeson had a son named Jason. When things got dangerous, Aeson cleverly sent his son to the mountains of Pelion, where the centaur Chiron took care of him. When Jason grew up, he returned to Iolcos to find his father and reclaim the throne. By this time, Aeson was old, his hair was gray, and his eyesight was nearly gone, but he still recognized his son. News of Jason's return and his claim to the throne spread throughout the land. Peleus, now an old man, was aware that Jason had the support of the people, and while Jason only sought the throne and not Peleus' life, Peleus still feared for his rule. Pelias, crafty as ever, secretly plotted to eliminate Jason and challenged him to travel to Colchis to retrieve the Golden Fleece to prove he was worthy of being the hero king of Iolcos. Jason accepted this challenge. Though he didn't have divine assistance, Jason was far from alone. He gathered a group of heroic companions and built a ship. 50 renowned heroes from all over Greece came together in Iolcos. The first to join Jason was Hercules, and there were other notable names like Idas and Lynceus, the sons of Zeus, Calais and Zetes, the winged brothers, sons of Boreas, the god of the north wind, Admetus, Telamon, Meleager, and many more. Once the crew was assembled, Jason received divine guidance. Athena appeared to him and helped him in constructing the ship, providing a sacred piece of wood taken from an oak tree in Zeus's forest in Dodona. The ship was named Argo, which means swift in Greek. The sailors aboard the ship were then known as the Argonauts. On the journey of the Argo to Colchis, many things happened, challenges and hardships along the way. But it would be too long to go into all the details, so I'll just briefly mention one important event. During their journey, the Argonauts made a stop on the island of Lemnos, not far from the city of Troy. Lemnos was an island inhabited entirely by women, ruled by Queen Hypsipyle. The backstory is that Hypsipyle's father, King Thoas, for reasons unknown, suddenly decreed that the worship of the goddess Aphrodite should be abandoned. Aphrodite, offended, cursed the women of Lemnos by making them smell terribly, which caused their men to abandon them. Although the men left, they occasionally returned to visit, but they still couldn't bear to be near the women due to their stench. The women, frustrated and angry, decided to take revenge. So, on one of the men's visits, the women ambushed and killed all of them. Whether with knives or the smell, No one knew for sure. Time passed, and then the Argo arrived at Lemnos. Hypsipyle called the women together to discuss whether they should welcome the Argonauts. They decided to set up an altar and pray to Aphrodite for forgiveness, and the goddess granted her approval. Queen Hypsipyle, eager to meet the Argonauts, waited by the city gates. It had been years since the women had any male company, so the celebrations were wild. Both sides enjoyed a feast and revelry that lasted for days. Of course, being a hero at that time meant you were the king of everything, especially with the ladies. However, Hercules and a few others stayed behind to guard the ship and didn't get a share of the fun. After waiting for so long, Hercules grew frustrated and went into the city, scolding everyone before they finally set sail again. While this part isn't particularly important, I thought it was worth mentioning because it's kind of amusing. Now, the important event happened in Mysia, when the Argonauts stopped to rest. Hylas, a handsome companion of Hercules, was sent to find fresh water. When he found a spring, he saw the nymphs, who were dancing and singing. The nymphs, noticing the handsome young man gazing at them, became enamored with him. They kidnapped him and pulled him into the spring, making it vanish. Hylas barely had time to scream, "Ah!" Hercules was with Hylas at the time, but they had gone in different directions. Hearing the cry, Hercules rushed to find Hylas but could not locate him. The next morning, the people on the shore were visited by the god Glaucus, who informed them that Hercules must return to Greece to serve Eurystheus as a slave for 12 years. As for Hylas, well, he had gone with the nymphs, and that was that. With that, the Argo set sail again, this time without Hercules. Additionally, this event might explain a religious ritual in the coastal region of Propontis, now known as the Sea of Marmara, where every year priests would run across the fields, calling out Hylas' name. After arriving in Colchis, Jason led his companions to meet King Aetes. Jason clearly explained the purpose of their journey, and of course, no Greek hero's tale would be complete without challenges. To obtain the Golden Fleece, Jason had to pass through 3 difficult trials. The first trial required him to tame 2 fierce bulls with bronze feet that breathed fire. If you're not familiar with what a yoke is, it's a wooden bar that ties the heads of oxen or horses together to pull a plow. In ancient Greece, this was metaphorically a symbol of dominion or control. Now, these bulls were gifts from Hephaestus, the god of blacksmiths, to King Aetes, and they had never let anyone near, let alone defeated. After taming the bulls, Jason had to use the yoke to plow a field. Once the field was plowed, he had to sow the teeth of a serpent in the soil. These were indeed formidable tasks, but don't worry, Jason had a powerful ally. King Aetes had a beautiful daughter named Medea. Medea was a devout follower of Hecate, the 3-headed goddess of witchcraft, and she was skilled in magic. When she heard that a guest from Greece had arrived, she was curious and went to the guest chamber to observe. In that moment, as their eyes met, Cupid, or Eros, hiding somewhere, shot 2 arrows, causing a love strike between Jason and Medea, just like the tale of Mi Chao and Trong Thuy in Vietnamese legend. That night, Medea secretly sent word to Jason, asking him to meet her the next morning at the temple of Hecate. At the temple, Medea instructed Jason on how to perform a sacrifice to Hecate, and then gave him a vial of oil made from the resin of a plant that grew from the blood of Prometheus. When Jason rubbed this oil on his skin, it protected him from fire, allowing him to safely place the yoke on the fiery bulls and tame them. Jason then sewed the serpent's teeth, the very same teeth from the serpent that Cadmus had slain when he was searching for Europa. As expected, warriors sprang from the ground. Jason, knowing what to do, threw a stone in the middle of them, causing them to fight each other. As the battle wore on, Jason took advantage of the chaos and emerged victorious. King Aetes, upon seeing that Jason had seemingly hacked the trials, immediately retreated and called for a council with the elders, meeting through the night. Still harboring his disdain for the Argonauts and unwilling to part with the Golden Fleece, Aeetes made the decision to destroy the Argo and eliminate the entire crew. He quickly deduced that Jason must have inside help, and, after some thought, realized that Medea was the one behind it. Medea, sensing something was amiss after hearing her father's prolonged meeting, decided to act. In the dead of night, she secretly fled to the Argonauts and warned them of the impending danger. Medea urged Jason to leave immediately and take the Golden Fleece while they still had the chance. Without hesitation, Jason geared up and followed Medea. The two made their way to the sacred grove of Ares, where the Golden Fleece was guarded by a dragon coiled around the tree that held it. As soon as the dragon smelled a human presence, it shot a blast of fire, warning of its approach, even though no enemy had been seen. Medea, calm under pressure, prayed to Hypnos, the god of sleep, and spread a magical potion on the ground. As she chanted an incantation, a dense fog filled the air and the dragon slowly drifted off to sleep. With the creature subdued, Jason quickly climbed the tree and seized the Golden Fleece. With the fleece in hand, the two returned to the Argo, where Jason ordered the ship to set sail immediately, leaving no time for delay. By morning, when King Aetes discovered that the Golden Fleece was missing, he sent his men to pursue the Argonauts and retrieve the fleece. The journey back was fraught with peril. storms, violent winds, and relentless pursuit. But since this part of the story is lengthy, I'll skip over the details. In modern Western literature, the term Argonauts has evolved to refer to brave sailors or adventurers who embark on perilous quests. More specifically, it has come to represent those in search of wealth or those pursuing a career that promises riches. Expanding further, the term can also symbolize anyone who bravely faces challenges and ventures into unknown or difficult paths. The Golden Fleece, in turn, has come to symbolize a grand and difficult pursuit, one that requires immense effort, sacrifice, and perseverance to achieve. The Golden Fleece was brought back to Iolcos, and the entire city held a grand ceremony to welcome the precious artifact. Everyone rejoiced, for at last the treasure of Greece had returned to its rightful place. However, while Jason was away, Peleus continued his cruel treatment of Aeson, Jason's father. One version of the story suggests that Medea used her magic to make Aeson young again, which made Peleus desire the same transformation for himself. This was part of Medea's plan to take revenge on Peleus, who had failed to honor his promise of giving the throne to Jason. Medea used her magic to make Aeson fall into a deep sleep on a bed of enchanted grass. She then prepared a potion in a copper cauldron. Once the potion was ready, Medea took a sword and slashed Aeson's throat, letting his aged blood flow out, blood that had made him weak and frail. She then poured the magical potion she had brewed into his body, stitching his neck back together. When Aeson awoke, he was as young and strong as a man in his 20s. His transformation amazed Peleus' daughters, who were eager to learn how Medea had done it. To convince them further, Medea threw an old sheep into the cauldron. Some versions of the story say that Medea cut the sheep into pieces before adding it to the potion. After a short time, a healthy, lively lamb sprang from the cauldron, jumping around energetically. Peleus' daughters were thoroughly impressed by Medea's powers and begged her to help make their father young again. Peleus was brought to Medea's home and placed on the enchanted grass. The potion was boiling, but this time, it wasn't the same one that had worked on Aeson. Medea instructed Peleus' daughters to slit their father's throat, but none of them had the courage to do it. Finally, one of them, braver than the rest, stepped forward and did the deed. But, to their horror, Peleus died immediately. Medea rushed over and took the sword, stabbing him several more times to make sure he was dead. Returning to the main story, these two bulls, gifts from Hephaestus to King Aeetes, were now defeated by Jason and Medea, who took revenge on the cruel king, with just as much cruelty in return. Peleus' daughters were so shocked by the events that they went mad, while his sons, angered by the betrayal, refused to allow Jason to inherit the throne, as they considered him complicit in their father's death. Jason and Medea were forced to flee Iolcos and sought refuge in the land of Corinth, ruled by King Creon. Life went on for Medea and Jason in relative peace. Medea gave birth to 2 sons, and for a time it seemed like their lives would continue this way. However, tragedy struck once again. King Creon of Corinth had a beautiful daughter named Glauce. Her beauty, and more importantly, her status caught the eye of Jason, who, despite his past with Medea, began to pursue her. King Creon, aware of the situation, did not intervene and instead offered Glauce's hand in marriage to Jason. Medea, heartbroken, found herself betrayed once more, having already turned on her own father and killed her brother, and now being forsaken by Jason for another woman. In her rage, Medea cursed Jason, Glauce, and Creon, vowing to turn them all into corpses. Jason and Creon soon learned of the curse, and Jason hurried to Medea to explain his actions. He claimed that he had married Glauce not for her status, but for the future of their children. However, Creon was not as forgiving as Jason, knowing full well that Medea was a powerful sorceress devoted to Hecate, and he ordered that Medea and her children be expelled from Corinth. Medea begged Creon for one more day to settle her affairs, but in truth, she was planning her revenge. At that time, King Aegeus of Athens was in Corinth, seeking guidance from the god Apollo, hoping for a cure to his childlessness. Hearing of this, Medea approached Aegeus and offered to help him, promising to use her magic to aid him. Aegeus, in turn, agreed to protect Medea, but made it clear that she would have to go to Athens herself, as Creon would be angered by her staying in Corinth. With Aegeus' promise of protection in hand, Medea prepared to exact her revenge. She went to Jason and asked for permission to let her 2 sons stay in Corinth, claiming they would offer gifts to Glauce to make peace. Jason agreed, and Medea gave her children a poisoned robe and a golden crown to present to the princess. When Glauce received the gifts, she immediately tried them on, but as soon as she wore the robe, her body began to tremble, her eyes rolled back in her head, and foam poured from her mouth. The crown on her head burst into flames, setting her body alight and turning her into a living torch. Creon rushed to her aid, but upon touching the robe, was also engulfed in flames. Both father and daughter died in the inferno. Afterward, Medea turned her wrath onto her own children. When they returned with the gifts, she locked them in a room and killed them, eliminating Jason's bloodline as a final act of revenge. When Jason learned of the deaths, he rushed to Medea, only to find that she had already fled to Athens, taking the bodies of their children with her, denying Jason the right to bury them. Devastated and mad with grief, Jason wandered aimlessly, haunted by the loss of his family and the destruction of his life. One day, while wandering by the shore, Jason came across the Argo, the ship on which he had once sailed with the Argonauts. After their return from Colchis, the ship had been dedicated to Poseidon. Seeing the ship brought back memories of better days, and Jason, filled with sorrow, lay down beneath it to rest. It was there that he met his end. A plank from the Argo, which had been resting on the shore, fell loose and struck him in the head, killing him instantly. There was no funeral, no mourning, just a man who had once been a great hero, now dead and forgotten. The story of Jason is a stark reminder of the ancient Greek lesson that even the greatest of heroes, no matter their fame or strength, can be brought low by their desires. The lesson: unchecked ambition, lust, and greed can lead to destruction, and even the mightiest will eventually fall alone and broken. Now let's continue with the story of King Aegeus, who had taken Medea in. He was a descendant of Cecrops, the first king of Athens, and despite his illustrious life, he faced the hardship of being childless. After 2 marriages, Aegeus still had no heir to continue his line. So he traveled to the Oracle of Delphi to seek guidance from Apollo, but the prophecy he received was vague and cryptic. Desperate for clarity, Aegeus went to the city of Troezen to consult with the wise king Pythias. Pythias, after pondering the oracle's words, deduced that Aegeus would father a heroic son. He then decided to marry his daughter Aethra to Aegeus, believing it would result in a great hero. Thus, this spontaneous marriage between Aegeus and Aethra led to the birth of Theseus. Theseus grew to be one of the greatest heroes in Greek mythology, and the Athenians even considered him a historical figure. He accomplished so many heroic deeds that the saying, "What's hard? Theseus can do it," became popular in ancient Athens. However, some versions of the story claim that Theseus was not actually Aegeus' son, but the son of Poseidon, as Poseidon had used magic to seduce Aethra, thus NTRing Aegeus. Before leaving Troezen, Aegeus left behind a sword and a pair of sandals under a large rock at the foot of Mount Troezen, telling Aethra that when Theseus grew up, he should come find him in Athens, taking the sword and sandals with him. Theseus grew up in Troezen. Raised by his mother and grandfather, his grandfather, a wise man, took great care in educating him, and many teachers were brought in to instruct him in various skills, the most notable being the centaur Chiron. By the time Theseus was 17, he had grown into a strong, handsome young man with a well-proportioned body and a face full of determination. Following his mother's instructions, Aethra packed his belongings for him to set off in search of his father. Theseus lifted the large rock, took the sandals and sword, and set off for Athens. While his mother and grandfather wanted him to take the safer, quicker route by sea, Theseus, determined to do things his way, chose to walk. His journey to Athens was filled with many challenges, especially from bandits who claimed the roads as their own and demanded tolls. Theseus, however, dealt with each bandit in a fitting manner, killing them with the same methods they had used on others. One of the most notorious encounters was with the bandit Procustes, meaning the stretcher, who would force travelers to lie on an iron bed. If the person was too short, he would stretch them to fit, and if they were too long, he would chop off their limbs. When Theseus encountered Procustes, he fought him, bound him to the same bed, and used his sword to adjust him to fit the bed, ensuring he received the same treatment he had inflicted on others. This story gave rise to the Western literary term Procustes bed, which refers to a rigid standard or principle that is inapplicable or unrealistic, but is used to force things to fit, often at the expense of their natural form. When Theseus arrived in Athens, he did not reveal his identity but pretended to be a foreigner seeking help. At this time, Aegeus had married Medea after taking her in from Corinthia, and they had a son together. Upon seeing a stranger arrive to offer help, Medea investigated and found out that he was Aegeus' son from Troezen. Fearing that her own son would not inherit the throne if Theseus succeeded, Medea devised a plan to kill him. She accused Theseus of being a spy sent by enemy forces to conquer Athens. Since Aegeus had been rather confused since marrying Medea, he believed her and brought a poisoned cup of wine to Theseus during a welcoming feast. Fortunately, due to a custom forbidding guests from carrying weapons to the feast, Theseus had taken off his sword and hung it on the wall. When Aegeus saw the sword, he immediately recognized it as his own and looked down at Theseus' sandals, which were also identical to his. Realizing the truth, Aegeus quickly knocked the poisoned wine from Theseus' hands. After talking for a while, the two recognized each other as father and son. Medea, her malicious plan exposed, was spared death but was banished from Athens along with her son. Aegeus then held a public announcement declaring that his son, Theseus, had arrived from Trozen to take his rightful place, just as the prophecy from Delphi had foretold. The people celebrated and rejoiced as the heroic deeds of Theseus on his journey to Athens were shared with the city. However, Aegeus' brother Pallas was not pleased. Pallas had hoped that after Aegeus' death, the throne would pass to his sons. With Theseus now in the picture, Pallas saw only one way to secure the throne for his own lineage: by killing Theseus. He sent 50 of his sons to attack Athens, but Theseus easily defeated them. Next, Theseus decided to prove his strength by taking on another challenge, the wild bull of Marathon. This was the same bull Hercules had captured on the island of Crete as part of a task for Eurystheus, but Eurystheus had released it, and it had caused chaos in the fields of Marathon. Like Hercules, Theseus managed to defeat the bull with his bare hands and brought it back to Athens to offer it as a sacrifice to the god Apollo. Some versions of the story suggest that this was another of Medea's attempts to kill Theseus. After that, Theseus sailed to Crete to confront the half-man, half-bull monster, the Minotaur. To understand the origins of the Minotaur, we must go back to the story of Zeus and Europa. Their union produced 3 sons: Minos, Rhadamanthi, and Sarpedon. To become the king of Crete, Minos prayed to Poseidon to send him a bull as a sign of divine favor. Poseidon agreed, but in return, Minos was supposed to sacrifice the bull to Poseidon. However, Minos, taken by the beauty of the bull, decided to keep it and sacrifice a different one instead. In retaliation, Poseidon cursed the bull, making it go wild, destroying crops, and ultimately causing it to mate with Minos' wife. From this union, the Minotaur was born. Minos, unable to bring himself to kill the Minotaur, was left with a dilemma. The monster was too dangerous to be left free, yet too horrifying to be seen in public. He decided to imprison it in a maze-like palace. This labyrinth was designed by Daedalus, a master craftsman who had been exiled to Crete for the crime of murder. In Crete, Daedalus became renowned, and Minos asked him to construct the labyrinth to imprison the Minotaur. The labyrinth was a complex, confusing structure, so intricate that no one who entered it could find their way out. Today, the word labyrinth is used in Western languages to describe any kind of maze. To feed the Minotaur, Minos required human sacrifices. Each year, after victorious campaigns and asserting control over territories, he demanded that local kings send living people to be devoured by the Minotaur. Athens, too, was subject to this horrific tribute. This all began after the death of Androgeus, Minos' son, who had won all the prizes at the Panathenaic Games in Athens. Jealous of the foreigner outperforming their local athletes, Aegeus, the king of Athens, sent Androgeus to deal with the bull at Marathon, where Androgeus was tragically gored to death by the beast. Minos, enraged, raised an army to attack Athens and forced the city to pay tribute for 9 years. Each year, Athens had to send 7 young men and 7 young women to Crete as sacrifices for the Minotaur. After 3 years of this, the people of Athens could bear it no longer. In response to this crisis, Theseus asked his father for permission to go to Crete and confront the Minotaur. He volunteered to enter the labyrinth with the annual tribute and fight the monster. Aegeus, unable to stop his son, could only give him a final piece of advice. If Theseus returned victorious, he should raise a white sail. If he failed and died, he should raise a black sail. Just like Jason, Theseus received divine assistance, but in this case it came in the form of Ariadne, much like a Mai Chao. While watching the procession of the tribute with her father, King Minos, Ariadne saw Theseus and immediately decided to run away with him. Taking advantage of a moment when no one was looking, Ariadne went to meet Theseus and offered him advice. She gave him a ball of thread, telling him to unwind it as he ventured into the labyrinth so he could find his way back. To further help him, Ariadne also gave Theseus a sharp knife as a weapon, and asked him if he returned victorious to take her with him to Greece. The tribute group entered the labyrinth, and Ariadne stood outside, holding the thread Theseus had unwound. The thread began to twitch, signaling to her that the battle between Theseus and the Minotaur had begun. The two fought for quite a while, with the Minotaur fighting wildly, while Theseus, trained and methodical, gradually gained the upper hand and defeated the beast. Theseus followed the thread back out of the labyrinth, and immediately with his companions and Ariadne, they prepared to sail away. They had to leave quickly, or their lives would be at risk. To prevent the Cretans from following them, Theseus had instructed his men to destroy the ships docked on the shore. Today, in Western literature, the Ariadne's thread has become a metaphor for a method that helps one escape a difficult situation or find a way out of a maze, similar to the North Star or compass in Vietnamese culture. During the journey back to Greece, the happiest moments for Theseus were likely with Ariadne. However, when the group stopped at the island of Naxos to rest, Theseus had a dream where he encountered the god, Dionysus. Dionysus commanded Theseus to leave immediately without delay and forbade him from taking Ariadne with him. Despite the pain in his heart, Theseus dared not defy the will of the gods. He woke up his companions, ordered the ship to set sail, and left Ariadne, who was still asleep, behind. The next morning, when Ariadne awoke, she was shocked and confused. She spent the whole day cursing Theseus for abandoning her. That night, however, a miracle occurred. Dionysus appeared in all his glory, accompanied by his entourage, to take Ariadne as his wife. The playful god made her his bride, bringing joy to her once again. As for Theseus, he sailed on, feeling lost and regretful, forgetting the promise he had made to his father. When they approached Athens, King Aegeus stood at the cliff, waiting for his son's return. Seeing the ship but noticing the black sails, Aegeus, in his old age, realized that his son had not survived, and, in his despair, jumped into the sea, ending his life. When Theseus arrived and heard the tragic news, he was filled with immense regret. In his sorrow, he named the sea where his father had died the Aegean Sea, the body of water between Greece and Asia Minor, with Crete lying to the south. In Crete, when Minos learned of the Minotaur's death, he was furious, not because he mourned the creature, but because he had been outplayed. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became, especially at his daughter for her betrayal. After stewing over the situation, Minos came up with a plan. He decided to imprison Daedalus, the one person who knew the secret of the labyrinth, and who was also from the same city as Theseus, Athens. Minos had Daedalus thrown into the labyrinth, along with his son Icarus as punishment. Some versions of the story suggest that Daedalus was the one who devised the plan involving the thread for Ariadne. But even though Daedalus was locked in the labyrinth, he did not despair. The maze was full of various obstacles, dead birds, large beehives, and other challenges. Daedalus gathered feathers, wax, and the beeswax from the hives to create wings for himself and his son. In just a few days, Daedalus had fashioned 2 pairs of wings. He and Icarus then escaped by flying out of the labyrinth, heading toward Greece. Although Daedalus had warned his son not to fly too high or too low, high enough to avoid the sun's heat and low enough to avoid the humidity from the sea. Once Icarus took flight, he was overcome by the joy of freedom. He flew higher and higher, curious to see what was above. But as he soared closer to the sun, the wax on his wings melted, and in an instant, Icarus plummeted into the sea, falling to his death. Devastated, Daedalus could not find his son's body in the vast, open sea. He continued his journey alone, not returning to Greece, but instead heading to the city of Cumae on the island of Sicily, where he sought refuge with King Cacaius. Minos, however, somehow discovered where Daedalus had fled and brought an army to Sicily. King Cacaius, unwilling to oppose Minos directly but also unwilling to hand Daedalus over, used an old Greek custom to help Daedalus. When a guest of honor arrived, they would be offered hot water for a foot bath and invited to bathe before the feast. While Minos was in the bathhouse, Daedalus had secretly altered the pipes, so instead of hot water, boiling oil was released, effectively cooking Minos alive. This marked the end of Minos' tyrannical reign. After Minos' death, Daedalus remained in Sicily, building magnificent temples and palaces in gratitude to King Cacaius. Other versions suggest that Daedalus returned to Athens, where he taught his craft to future generations. As for Minos, after his death, he descended to the underworld, where Hades appointed him as one of the judges of the dead. He worked alongside his brother Rhadamanthi and Aeacus, the king of the island of Aegina, to judge the souls of the deceased. Back to Theseus, he had a close companion named Pirithous, the king of the Lapiths in Thessaly. One day, Pirithous invited Theseus to his wedding, but there were also centaur guests at the celebration. This was because Pirithous, though human, was a half-brother to the centaurs. His father, Ixion, had conspired to seduce Zeus and slept with a cloud that took the shape of Hera, resulting in the birth of the centaur race. Due to this blood connection, the centaurs often demanded that Pirithous give up his throne, but he tried to maintain peace with them. Inviting them to the wedding was his way of fostering harmony. However, hoping for peace with a half-human, half-horse race born from a cloud and man union was unrealistic. During the wedding celebration, a centaur rushed in, abducted the bride, and ran off. The others followed, abducting women in the chaos. The wedding turned into a battlefield. In Greek custom, guests were not allowed to bring weapons to a feast, so those with cups used them, those with bottles used them, and those who could use chairs did so. When the human side finally broke free and armed themselves, the centaurs were quickly overwhelmed and defeated. The victory of the Lapiths over the centaurs symbolized the triumph of civilization over barbarism. It reflected the societal shift in ancient Greece, from the savagery of matriarchal tribal systems to a more cultured, patriarchal way of life, a theme often reflected in hero myths. products of patriarchal societies. After reclaiming his wife from the centaurs, Pirithous soon lost her to illness, and as time passed, he began thinking about remarrying. He went to Athens to discuss this with Theseus. At the time in Sparta, there was the famously beautiful Helen, who was said to surpass all other Greek women in beauty. So the two widowers decided to abduct Helen together. They took her to Athens and hid her there. But since they shared in the success, they decided to draw lots to see who would get Helen. Theseus won, but in the spirit of their bond, he agreed to help Pirithous find a wife. Pirithous, however, had a bizarre idea. He wanted to abduct Persephone, the wife of Hades, from the underworld. So the two men made their way to the realm of Hades. Somehow, they managed to get past Charon, the ferryman of the underworld, and the three-headed dog, Cerberus, and entered Hades' palace, demanding Persephone be handed over. Hades pretended to be pleased with their visit, inviting them to sit. But suddenly chains erupted from the ground, binding the two men to their seats. These were the infamous Forgotten Chairs, a powerful trap of Hades. Later, Theseus was freed by Hercules, returning to the mortal world, while Pirithous remained trapped in the underworld, eternally bound to his chair. While Theseus was bound to the Forgotten Chair, Helen's two brothers, Castor and Polydeuces, had been searching everywhere for their sister. Eventually, they were directed to Athens by the hero Acidamus. The two brothers then led an army to Athens, and with the absence of its king, Athens was unable to resist. The Spartans freed Helen and captured Aethra, Theseus' mother, taking her as a prisoner. They then handed over the rule of Athens to Menestheus, a man who had been exiled from the city. When Theseus returned, he found his kingdom and family in ruins. Eventually, Lycomedes led Theseus up a mountain and pushed him off a cliff, marking the tragic end of the greatest hero of Attica. Once again, we see the story of a hero who had it all but, driven by his desire for beauty, especially the beauty of a goddess, found himself lost in oblivion, stripped of his wealth and status, and dying in disgrace. It was many years later that Theseus' son, Demophon, managed to restore his family's power in Athens. Some sources also suggest that Theseus took part in the Argonauts' quest for the Golden Fleece, but this theory conflicts with the fact that Theseus first met Aegeus after he had married Medea. As for the hero Academus, who had pointed the Spartans toward Helen, he was buried in a small forest outside Athens after his death. The ancient Greeks, in his honor, named this forest Academia. In the 4th century BCE, the philosopher Plato often came to teach in this very forest, and the school he founded was called Academia. Over time, the term academia evolved in Western languages to refer to an institution of higher learning, or a center for the brightest minds in a nation, similar to what we call an academy in Vietnamese. The story of the 3rd and 4th generations of heroes primarily revolves around the tale of Oedipus and his children. It all begins in a prosperous city-state in Greece, where a king and queen gave birth to a son. However, the birth was not a joyous occasion, as a prophecy foretold that the child would cause the death of his father and bring ruin to the entire family. In fear, the king ordered that the child be abandoned on Mount Cithaeron to be left for wild animals to devour. But the servant, unable to carry out the king's command, took pity on the child and handed him over to a shepherd. The shepherd named the baby Oedipus, but because he was poor, he could not afford to raise him. So he took Oedipus to King Polybius of Corinth, who had no children, and adopted the boy as his own. Oedipus grew up as the heir to the throne of Corinth. One day, he consulted an oracle, and the prophet revealed that Oedipus would kill his father and marry his mother. Terrified by the prophecy, Oedipus fled Corinth, determined to avoid his fate. He wandered through Greece, trying to escape the prophecy's grasp. One day, Oedipus encountered a nobleman riding in a chariot on a narrow road. The nobleman's servant pushed Oedipus aside to let the chariot pass. Infuriated, Oedipus struck the servant, then killed the nobleman and his entourage, leaving only one servant alive. Oedipus continued his journey and eventually heard about a sphinx that had been terrorizing Thebes. Eager to prove himself as a hero, he set out to defeat it. The sphinx lay on a rock near the city's entrance, and anyone who wished to enter Thebes had to answer its riddle. Those who answered incorrectly were eaten by the creature. Many had perished because of this dreadful beast. At the time, Thebes was mourning the death of King Laius, and the regent was Creon, Laius's brother-in-law, who had also lost his son to the Sphinx. Creon declared that whoever defeated the Sphinx would marry the widowed queen Jocasta and become the new king of Thebes. Oedipus approached the Sphinx and solved its riddle with ease. Humiliated, the Sphinx threw itself off a cliff, ending its reign of terror. Oedipus was hailed as a hero and married Jocasta, becoming the new king of Thebes. Despite her age, Jocasta's beauty remained remarkable, and the two lived happily together, having 4 children, 2 sons, Eteocles and Polynices, and 2 daughters, Antigone and Ismene. Sometime later, a great plague ravaged Thebes. Oedipus sent Creon to the Oracle of Delphi to seek a solution. The oracle's message was clear: the city would be cleansed only when the murderer of the late King Laius was expelled from Thebes. The only clue they had was that Laius had been killed on a narrow road. At that moment, a messenger from Corinth arrived to inform Oedipus that King Polybius had died and invited Oedipus to take the throne of Corinth. Although it was sad news, Oedipus was relieved because it meant the prophecy about him killing his father and marrying his mother was false. The messenger was actually the same shepherd who had once saved Oedipus, and he was the only one who could confirm the killer of Laius. As the truth was uncovered, it was revealed that the man Oedipus had killed on the narrow road was none other than King Laius, and his true parents were Laius and Queen Jocasta. In an attempt to avoid the prophecy, they had abandoned their child in the wilderness, and Oedipus, unknowingly fulfilling the prophecy, had fled Corinth. The grief-stricken Jocasta took her own life, and Oedipus, devastated by the revelation, gouged out his eyes, unable to face his parents in the underworld. He then exiled himself from Thebes. His daughter Antigone chose to stay by her father's side, offering him the last comfort a father could wish for. For Oedipus, Antigone's presence was like the final consolation from the gods, who had been cruel to him from the very beginning of his life. After Oedipus left, his two sons, Eteocles and Polynices, decided to alternate ruling Thebes, each taking a year. However, after the first year, Eteocles turned against his brother and expelled him from the city. It is worth noting that in the past the two brothers had angered their father, Oedipus, who had cursed them, saying they would eventually kill each other. After being exiled, Polynices went to Argos to seek refuge. There he met Tydeus, the exiled prince of Calydon. The two initially fought over a place to sleep, but soon they were found by King Adrastus, who, without hesitation, married off his two daughters to the two exiled princes and promised to help them regain their thrones, starting with Polynices. Adrastus gathered a large army to march against Thebes, which became known as the Seven Against Thebes. The army was led by 7 commanders, including Polynices and Titus. The battle was centered around the 7 gates of Thebes, with each commander fighting for control of one gate. Thebes also had 7 commanders, and the conflict was essentially 7 one-on-one duels. In the end, Polynices and his brother Eteocles killed each other, fulfilling their father's curse, and that is the story of the heroes of the 5th generation, marked by the Battle of Thebes. The 6th and final generation consists of the descendants of the heroes of Troy. I will continue their story in a later video, but for now, this video ends here.